Hi, welcome back. Today I'm here with one of my favorite videos of the year. This is my yearly stats video. So this is where I get super nerdy about all of the data from my reading in 2018. I am so ready for it, so let's go ahead and get into it. In 2018, I read a whopping 300 books. Yeah, 300. Which is a little bit crazy. It was a lot more than I was expecting, but I think I've gotten more efficient in my reading through the course of the year. My Goodreads goal this year was 75, so I blew right past that. This number does include graphic novels and novellas, so it isn't all full-length books, but the vast majority is. We're gonna get into the nitty-gritty on my stats, and one question I've been getting a lot on this is how I managed to read 300 books in a year. I will link a video up above where I talk about some of my tips on how to read more. You might find it helpful. The main thing that I would add to what's in that video is that I have since discovered audiobooks, and so those are now a significant part of my reading as well, and those are things that I can use to listen to while I'm doing other things like going grocery shopping or cleaning the house or whatever, and so that's also become a part of my reading diet. But ultimately what it is I don't watch a lot of television. I have a book with me everywhere. I read ebooks at the playground with my kids. I listen to audiobooks while I'm doing other things. I make reading a priority. I do read relatively quickly, I would say, but I also just make it a big priority in my life, and I like to alternate genres so that I don't get kind of stuck in a rut. So there you go. For those of you who've been asking for some tips on how to read more, that's a lot of how I do it, and feel free to check out that video that I linked up above as well. So, as I said, I read 300 books for a total of 102,937 pages. This does include number of pages in audiobooks. I am adding that into my total, so be aware that a portion of that is via audio. Next, let's look at my monthly breakdown of books. On average, I read about 25 books a month this year, and that is something that continued to increase throughout the year with some variation. My lowest month of 2018 was January, where I read 17 books. My highest in the year was November, where I read 33. However, 8 of those were novellas that are eventually going to go into a single bind-up, so you could potentially say that it was really closer to 25 books, which is still a lot, but not quite as high. I did have 3 months of the year where I read a total of 27 books. So that was September, October, and December. Let's go ahead and compare this to my stats of how many books that I read per month in 2017, just out of curiosity. So I will put up an image here so that you can see the comparison with how many books I read in 2017. My biggest reading month in 2017 was October, where I read 15 books, and I had a couple of months in 2017 where I didn't read any books, which is probably because I had a newborn baby. My youngest son was born in December of 2016, so he was like less than a month old in January. Last year I read 65 books. That is a huge increase to 300 books this year. Next year, I'm not sure that I necessarily want to try to read 300 books. If it happens, that's fine, but I really want to focus on being a little bit more strategic in the types of books that I'm picking up, and I think I'm getting to know a lot about my taste in reading as I go. Let's talk for a minute about age breakdown. This year, one of my goals was to work towards having more parity between the young adult books that I was picking up and the adult or middle grade books that I was picking up, with the goal of being 50-50. So last year I read 74% young adult, 20% adult, and 6% middle grade. My goal was to get down to 50% young adults, and I got very close to achieving it. I'm very happy with my stats for this year. In 2018, I read 52% YA, so I almost got down to 50%. I'm really, really happy with that number. 40% of my reading was adult, which is a pretty big increase from last year. About 5% of my reading was middle grade, and 2% of it was new adult. So I'm really happy with the progress that I've made on that front. In terms of genre, nobody should be surprised that the biggest piece of the pie, so to speak, is fantasy. Although it's actually not quite as high of a percentage as I had thought it might be, it is still definitely the biggest percentage of everything I've been reading. About 35.5% of the books that I read in 2018 fell into the fantasy category, and surprisingly, my next biggest genre category this year was contemporary for 13%. I don't really think of myself as reading that much contemporary, but apparently it must be more than I'm realizing. I had 10% science fiction, romance was about 8%, and nonfiction was 7.5%. Lots of other genres creating much smaller categories. So close to half of what I read this year falls into the sci-fi fantasy category, which again is not terribly surprising to me, but it is really interesting to see the genre breakdown. I do feel like I read more from a wide variety of genres this year than I did last year. I had wanted to start integrating some literary fiction and some nonfiction into my reading, and I think I definitely achieved that. Next, let's talk about the format of the books that I read, and I think this is pretty interesting. I do anticipate these numbers changing a little bit for 2019 just because it wasn't until at least halfway through the year that I started integrating audiobooks into my reading, so I expect that they will take up a larger percentage in 2019 than they did in 2018. But for 2018, almost 36% of the books I read were paperbacks, 27% were hardcovers, 20% were ebooks, 12.5% were audiobooks, and again, I expect that percentage to rise probably pretty significantly for 2019, and about 4% of the books that I read were graphic novels. So a few graphic novels here and there, but there aren't that many of them. I'm pretty choosy about the ones that I enjoy reading. So another question might be, where are these books coming from? Are these ARCs? Are these books that I purchased? Are these books from my library? And the answer is a little bit of both. A little over 30% of the books that I read this year were new books that I either purchased or was gifted. I know there is a gift category, but I often forgot to use it when I was tracking this last year, so you could probably merge the gifted category and the new, so say around 33% of the books that I read were new, either gifted or purchased by myself. 32% of the books that I read were ARCs, so that took up a pretty significant chunk of my reading in 2018. That means that about 90 of the books that I read were advanced reader copies. I did use my library, a fairly significant amount. 23% of the books that I read were from my library. A lot of those, especially later in the year, were probably audiobooks through the Overdrive app, but I do use my library for a lot of physical books, and I get almost all of my graphic novels at the library. Only 8.5% of the books that I read were used, which actually surprises me quite a bit because I buy a lot of used books, so it's interesting to me that I didn't end up reading as many as I might have expected. I would probably be happy to see that percentage rise in the next year. So if you've seen my goals video for 2019, you might know that one of my goals this year was to read an average of one book a month by an indie author, one book a month of nonfiction, and one book a month of translated fiction. So I had sort of set this for myself without looking at the numbers of what I read in 2018, so it was really interesting to me when I went back and looked, because I actually read more indie authors and more nonfiction than I had anticipated. In 2018, I read 17 books by indie authors, which is more than I had thought it was going to be, so I'm pretty happy with that. I do want to maintain making it a priority to feature indie authors where I can on my channel. My goal is an average of one a month. If there ends up sometimes being more than that, that's fine, but in general, that's the goal that I'm shooting for. I read 23 nonfiction books in 2018, which again was more than I had realized. I did feel like I was picking up more nonfiction than I had previously, so I'm really happy to see how many I ended up integrating. In terms of translated fiction, I only read one book that was translated fiction as far as I know, so that is definitely a place for me to grow. My goal is to try to read an average of one a month because it's a place that I think I'm lacking and I would like to get better. Another thing that I think is kind of interesting to look at is publication date. So when were most of the books I was reading being released? And considering the fact that I did read 35% ARCs and I've been reading a lot of new releases, I'm not terribly surprised to see that 52% of the books that I read were published in 2018. That means 150, so half of the books that I read were 2018 releases, which should explain to you why I ended up doing a best of 2018 video where I highlight 40 of my favorites out of those 150 2018 releases. I can link that video up above if you haven't already seen it. I break it down by genre category and tell you what I think are my favorites for all these different categories of the books that I read that were published in 2018. But I did also read a lot of books that were published in other years. Less than 2% of the books I read are 2019 releases for this year, arcs that I read early. So that means that 45% of the books that I read were published prior to 2018. However, most of them were pretty recently published. About 16% of the books I read were published in 2017, so not super old, 7.5% in 2016, and 6% in 2015. And then the rest take up much smaller chunks. Some of the ones that aren't labeled are probably the few books that I've read that were published back in like the 90s or the early 2000s, so the bulk of what I've read has been relatively recent releases within the last 5 years or so. I would like to get better about including some classics into my reading. That isn't something that I did a very good job of in 2018, so that's something I might be thinking about moving forward. Okay, next up, let's talk about my rating breakdown. This I thought was pretty interesting. My average rating in 2018 was exactly the same as it was in 2017, 4.0. So 4 is an average rating for me. You might know that this year I decided to add in my personal rating scale a 6th star to my ratings for the books that go above and beyond that are my favorites of the year. So you will see that integrated in this chart. 24% of the books that I read, I gave 5 stars. Almost 28% got 4 stars from me. Only 6% of the books I read got 6 stars. While there were 18 books that I talked about in my favorites of the year video, which again I can link up above, those were the books that got 6 stars for me, it's actually a pretty small percentage of the books that I read. You figure for people who read like 100 books a year and do a top 10, that's 10% of what they've read. So for me, 18 books was only 6%, but those were my favorites of the year. I do rate by half stars, so you can kind of look at the breakdown there. I did not get very many 1-star reviews. It looks like it's probably less than 1% because it didn't even make it on here as a number. Less than 2% of the books I read got 2 stars. 5% got 2.5 stars. So that seems to be the place where a lot of my lower rated books are going. Like, I'm pretty happy with the spread of this. Would I like to see my ratings go down a little bit below an average of 4? Maybe. Like, I'm pretty comfortable with 4 being an average rating for me. I would be okay with getting it a little bit lower than that. We'll see how it goes, but I'm not feeling pressured about it. I'm fairly happy with that. Okay, so now we get to talk about diversity, and this I think is really interesting. This is probably the first year that for the entire year I was more aware of the authors that I was picking up and really actively trying to diversify my reading. So it's interesting to go in and look at my numbers in different categories when everything is said and done. So first let's talk about gender. I have always been one who tends to read a lot of female authors, and this year is no different. I want to say in 2017 I read something like 74% female authors. In 2018 I read more than 80% female authors, so predominantly female. I read 16% male authors, and about 3% fell into the category of both, which usually means a male and female were working together. I know there are some people who try to track whether they're reading authors who identify as gender fluid or gender non-binary. Tell me if you know where I can find a list of authors that that applies to, because I'm just not really sure where to find that information. So that isn't something that I've been tracking, but I'd be curious to know. But like I said, my goal was to increase the number of books that I was reading by authors of color, and I did fairly well, although in terms of percentages, it actually wasn't as high as I was hoping. In 2018, I read 80 books by authors of color, which sounds like a lot, but that's only 26% of my total books read in the year. So that might be something that I would keep an eye towards increasing. And this is for any non-white authors. So included in this are Black authors, Asian authors, Middle Eastern authors. I think I have one Native author, some Latinx authors. So this is kind of a mix all grouped in. Altogether, there were 80 books that I read by non-white authors. So again, it's only 26%. That is a number that I would probably like to see creep up next year. We'll see what we can do about that. And then I went through and tried to figure out, and hopefully next year I can track this better because I had to actually do this by memory, so I'm sure it's an imperfect calculation, but I went through the books that I read and tried to figure out which books that I read had either a main character or a primary side character who fell into the LGBTQ plus category. This wound up being true of 50 books that I read, which is 17%. I'm okay with that number. I suspect that it may go up next year. It was probably much lower previously, so I'm pretty happy with my progress in that. I think the place that I really want to work on increasing my percentages is the number of books that I'm reading by authors of color as opposed to white authors. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about that I thought was pretty interesting was my most read authors. So overall, I went through and counted how many authors I read just more than one book from. So I read at least 2 of their books. And there were 47 authors that I read at least 2 books from in 2018, which I think is pretty good. Then I went and found my top 6 most read authors, and this is anybody that I read more than 3 books from in 2018. So most of these I read 4 books, and then one of them was higher. So I read 4 books by Brian K. Vaughan. This is probably me picking up his Saga graphic novel series, and I think I also read 1 volume of Paper Girls in 2018. I also read 4 books by Leigh Bardugo. I read the entire Grisha trilogy, and I also read Wonder Woman Warbringer. And I anticipate reading more books by Leigh Bardugo in 2019. Then I read 4 books by Megan Whalen Turner. This is me working on catching up with the Queen's Thief series, which I have been absolutely loving. I have 1 more book to read before I am caught up, and then the final book in the series is coming out in 2019. So I anticipate reading 2 books by her next year, but for 2018 I read 4 books by her. I also read 4 books by Sarah J. Maas this year. I read Tower of Dawn and Kingdom of Ash. I also read A Court of Wings and Ruin and A Court of Frost and Starlight, so 4 books by her. And then I read 4 books by Susan Dennard. One of these is a repeat. I read Sight Witch early in the year, and then I reread the entire 3 books in the Witchland series. So Sight Witch was counted twice, but she is one of my favorite authors. I did read 4 books by her, one of them more than once. I also read 4 books by Victoria/V.E. Schwab in 2018. I read the final 2 books in the Shades of Magic trilogy. I read Vicious, and I read her new middle grade book, City of Ghosts. And finally, coming in at a whopping 11 books/novellas is Cassandra Clare. A lot of this is due to the fact that I read the currently published 8 novellas in the Ghosts of the Shadow Market series. They're fairly brief. Eventually they will go into a bind-up, so I read all of those 8, and then I also read 3 other books by her this year. I read Lord of Shadows, I read Queen of Air and Darkness, and I read Tales of the Shadowhunter Academy. So I thought that was pretty interesting to look at. One thing I would like to point out, and this is kind of for my own awareness, is that my top 6 most read authors are all white. So there is that. There is some diversity among them in that Victoria Schwab is gay and Leigh Bardugo is disabled, but in general, my most read authors are still looking pretty white. So that is for sure a thing that I would like to do better at next year. There are definitely authors of color that I read more than 1 book from. I think the most might have been 3 books from a single author, but that's something that I'd like to be a little bit more aware of moving into 2019 and try to up that number and have my most read authors at the end of the year look a little bit less homogenous. Okay, so that is it. Those are all of my stats for the year. It's been really interesting for me in terms of just personal reflection. I think when you actually sit down and look at all of your numbers, it's always quite surprising in some ways. Some of this is what I expected, some of it isn't, and I think it's really helpful for me thinking about my reading going forward into 2019, especially as a reviewer and as a member of the community that has some kind of a voice and platform. I do feel like it's important for me to be aware of some of these issues. All right, so 2 final things to wrap up. For those of you who are interested in where I got my spreadsheet to track all of my reading through the year, there is a fantastic spreadsheet created by Brock Roberts. You can find him on Twitter. You can create a copy for your Google Drive and use it to track your reading through the year. He does update it, and I have already started using his 2019 spreadsheet, and I'm really excited about some of the updates that he's made to it. I think it's going to be very, very cool. If you do want a more detailed video on the sorts of things that I track, feel free to let me know. I could make a video on that, but I use his spreadsheet and I track on Goodreads. And finally, I'm just going to do a quick little slideshow. Goodreads creates a nice graphic showing all of the stats as they tracked them for the year, as well as all of the books that you read. So for those of you who are interested, I will show a series of slides with images from that graphic. One thing to note, according to Goodreads, I read more than 300 books in the year. The reason for this is that there were a couple of children's books and picture books that I did review, but I didn't count for my own purposes in my spreadsheet. So that's why the numbers are a little bit different. With all of that said, I hope you enjoyed my long data nerdy stats video. I think this was really fun to make. I love these videos. I like watching other people's videos. I just find it to be really interesting. Question of the day, how do you track your reading, if you track it at all? Let me know in the comments down below. If you have any comments or questions, again, leave them below. I would really be interested to hear you guys' feedback on all of this. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up, subscribe if you want to see more. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.